Okay, guys, I'm coming live and direct from somewhere in Puerto Rico. I want to say hello. I've been asked to record this video and speak to you about this week's work. And before we get into that, let me say that you guys have done an outstanding job so far. First of all, you've kept safe, and that's very important. This virus has affected the entire world. Many people are dying. And unfortunately, we have been under lockdown for a couple of weeks now. Ya perdí la cuenta. But it's very unfortunate. It's very sad. Uh, I've actually known of people, not necessarily that are close to me, but people I know that have this virus up in New York, and it's very sad. It's very unfortunate. Let me say that you guys so far have done an outstanding job. I encourage you to continue doing the work that you've been doing. I was really satisfied with most of your work from last week, and I think your grade actually reflects that effort that you guys put into the summaries that you worked on last week. So I encourage you to continue doing the same. I encourage you to continue that path. And don't make mistakes. Read instructions. Follow through on every single specification. And read the rubric as well. Remember that we're using rubrics to grade your work, to grade your effort. So just make sure that you read instructions, but at the same time, you also read the rubric and you become familiarized with the work's requirement. As far as grammar is concerned, as far as sources is concerned, that's very important. Okay, so you got to follow through on that. So it's a little piece of advice that I'm giving you, free of charge. Now, let me say that we've been speaking about the U.S. Civil War, and we've been saying that in our class that the U.S. Civil War was a culmination of of many events, very important events, and several events. But the event that actually started the whole conflict was the election of a known abolitionist, a publicly known abolitionist, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, and by December, in other words, a month into having a president-elect, the first southern state, which was South Carolina, the first southern state actually broke away from the Union. That began an avalanche of southern states separating from the Union and forming their own parallel government, forming their own parallel nation. You already know that. I don't need to emphasize that. 1865 was a very important year. Why? Because it concluded the U.S. Civil War. Lincoln, with the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox in April of 1865. Days later, Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. But also, a couple of months earlier, in January of 1865, the 13th Amendment was adopted by Congress. Remember that in order for an amendment to actually go through, a U.S. constitutional amendment, it has to be approved by Congress, and then it goes to the states for ratification. We already spoke about that last semester. Ratification is important because it basically, in order for an amendment to go through, it has to not only be adopted by Congress, it also has to be in line with what the president wants and the president's public policies, right? So the president has to be on board, but also the states have to ratify the amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment, as some of you might know, outlaws slavery. However, the language that was adopted in the 13th Amendment gives way. It outlaws slavery, but it gives way to the Southern social structure, in other words, Southern society, to continue exploiting former slaves. And I thought that it was very pertinent in order for us to talk about the aftermath of the American Civil War. I thought, that it was very pertinent for us to to watch a documentary. This documentary is called 13th Amendment. You will find it in Netflix and you will find it in YouTube. So if you don't have a Netflix subscription, that's fine. You can go to YouTube, type in 13th Amendment, and you will find the documentary there as well. So you have two options, either Netflix or YouTube. Now, what does this documentary, what does it relate to? It's titled 13th Amendment, but it actually covers the history of the African American civil rights struggle after the US Civil War. I mean, we all know about civil rights through Martin Luther King and contemporary history, and we know of the civil rights movement during the 50s and the 60s, but that was actually something that began many years prior to the 50s and the 60s, 100 years prior, as a matter of fact. So right after the US Civil War, there was an effort to promote African American and former slaves' civil rights, but there was plenty of resistance because even though slavery was outlawed, okay, as you're going to see in the documentary, the systematic exploitation of African Americans and former slaves and institutionalized segregation continued. So I ask you a question. Was exploitation, was discrimination, was social exclusion, was it actually over with the 13th Amendment? That's a big, important question for you to keep in mind while you're watching this video. So what do I want you to do? Remember, we're actually seeing the aftermath of the US Civil War. How upon the adoption of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War, things evolved. Okay? Keep that in mind. We're already done with the US Civil War, so we're actually going to see the aftermath now. And that documentary covers plenty. It covers the systematic discrimination, it covers the segregation, the institutionalized segregation of blacks and former slaves upon the end of the Civil War, and how very early on the civil rights movement actually begins. Because it doesn't begin with Martin Luther King. It doesn't begin with Malcolm X. It doesn't even begin with people like Marcus Garvey. It actually begins right upon the end of the Civil War. Okay? And this documentary covers it. I think that out of all the videos and the documentaries that I've seen, and I'm a history buff, so I keep track of this information. I think this is very complete. This documentary called 13th Amendment is very complete because it gives you an overall picture of what really happened in the United States upon the end of the Civil War and the 100-year struggle that that actually people went through in order to achieve their civil rights, their full civil, political, and social rights in the United States. So I want you to keep that in mind. All right? So what do I want you to do? Very simple. I want you to write a 3-paragraph short essay on the documentary. I want you to watch the video first, watch it carefully, go through every single concept, every single idea that the video discusses. Like, for example, the video discusses not only the 13th Amendment and how the 13th Amendment's language allowed, southern states to legalize discrimination in what was known as the Jim Crow laws, but how the system actually became, it actually allowed for the exploitation of African Americans, and how being African Americans in the United States after the US Civil War was criminalized. Okay? So the video actually covers plenty of concepts. Like, for example, It talks about, again, the 13th Amendment, and you already know about that, but it also talks about the Jim Crow laws. I want you to keep that in mind while you're watching the video. It talks about a very famous movie, an historical movie called The Birth of a Nation. I want you to keep track of that as well. I want you to keep track of what it says on the KKK, okay? The history behind the KKK and how politically involved they were in the United States very early on through the 1920s, the 1930s, and right upon the start or the reboot with Martin Luther King of the civil rights struggle in the 50s and the 60s. It actually talks about lynching, okay, how it became a very common and usual thing, especially in the South. It talks about mass incarceration. I want you to keep track of that as well. It talks about the Southern strategy, what politicians call the Southern strategy. And I want you to keep track of that. And the so-called war on drugs, upon many other concepts and ideas that you guys need to be paying attention and listening. Okay, what do I want you to do? I want you to write a short essay, a short essay on this documentary. I want you to pick 3 or 4 concepts, discuss them in first person, okay, first person always. Discuss these concepts in your short essay, okay? You will hand this assignment in on Friday by 12 noon, that's 12 p.m., 12 del mediodía, no 12 de la noche, no señor, 12 noon, 12 p.m., as always. You will make a virtual classroom submission. Please don't send your work by email, because I will return your email. I will not accept anything that's not handed in through the virtual classroom, okay? This short essay has to be identified. It has to have a title. You have to title, you have to name your short essay. It has to be identified. You have to include any source, any additional source that you might include or that you might resort to. That's fine, as long as you stick with the main concepts discussed in the video. Okay? You have to put your name. You have to put, as I said before, you have to put the date. You have to put your source. You have to put your group, and you have to comply with the 3 paragraph format. As you know, I always require, it's a short essay, so I mean, this shouldn't be complicated. It's a short essay that you will have to hand in by Friday. You have to meet these requirements. You have to have an opening statement. You have to have a main idea or a theme, right? You have to include these other topics, subtopics discussed in the video. Always write in first person. Remember that? That's a major requirement. And you will have a rubric attached to this assignment. Now, the purpose of the rubric, as you already know, is to actually grade your work. One suggestion: you have to read that rubric. You have to get familiarized, as I said earlier, with what the rubric says, what the rubric requires. It will have several criterias, okay? And those criterias need to be met in your work. Need to be met and need to be, you have to follow these criterias in order for your assignment to be successful. Watch your grammar. Watch your syntax. Please, and this is something that you have to follow through. Please proofread your work. You know, I've gotten many submissions that have actually many errors. Grammar is very important. Remember that this is a formal assignment, so you have to watch your grammar, watch your spelling. It doesn't take much. All you need to do is proofread your work. Because if you don't proofread your work, I will take points off. So remember, this is basically a short essay, a 10-sentence paragraph essay on this documentary. If you need further instructions, if you need me to discuss anything in particular, you may reach me at the virtual classroom platform. You may send a message. I don't have a problem with that. I can answer any questions you have. But please, I mean, this assignment will cover a major portion of our classroom curriculum. So, because it will go from the end of the Civil War up to the mid 1900s with the civil rights struggle. So please make sure you do a good job. Make sure you do you keep up with the work that you've been doing. You do not only satisfactory work, but make sure you yourself, you actually read your work, you fix your work before you send your work. You fix it, you proofread it, you make sure you comply with everything, and then you send it. So that way you'll be a little more successful as far as points are concerned. Okay, so guys, this is it for now. I will answer any questions that you have on this assignment. Remember that you have plenty of time. It's just a matter of sitting down, watching the video, taking notes, okay, on these concepts that the video discusses, okay, and then you move on to writing your short essay. Buena suerte. I think that you guys will do well. So just try to do the best that you can, guys. Okay? And remember, keep safe. Keep safe. Cuídense. Bye bye. Henry says hello, by the way.